Holding on Twitch.
It is Monday. Let's see what the old Facebook has to say.
Yeah, we're still allowed, so that's a positive thing. I think we're good.
Oh, good to go. Good. Thanks, Mr.
Yeah,
Zuckerbergs. So welcome to the Monday edition of the Crypto Flight Path live stream. It's April 10th, 2023. And I think that window might be minimized is why it's not showing up.
gotcha. Yeah, bear with me here on my technical difficulties.
Oh yes, it wouldn't be a good Monday without some sort of technical issue that was sent here by the universe to distract.
Hey, it's a good Monday nonetheless. So, all right,
But it's
we're golden. So, all
super.
right, let's get into it. Yeah, so Bitcoin over the weekend, had a nice little pop last night. Uh, Opened it and I was kind of like, oh, that's nice. It popped up to 28,300. Ethereum's a little bit over 1,800. So had some nice pop where that we've been consolidating in this range for a number of weeks now, and it still seems to be ranging. So uh, trying to figure out which way we want to go from here.
Yeah, I think my take on the price action is that there's there's a, there's a statistically significant number of people and a statistically significant amount of capital that is sitting on the sidelines right now for a couple different reasons. And this is just remember this is just theory, but uh, the the people having watched Bitcoin plumb the depths of 16,000 over the last or over the end of last quarter of 2022, and then take or turn an about face and then have this very strong march to the upside. I think there's some interesting things that were going on there. One conspiracy theory that I have has to do with the idea of hypothecating or hypothecation, which I won't take us down this rabbit hole necessarily, but I will just briefly briefly outline what I think could be a contributing factor to the big run up that we had this year so far. And it has to do with the following: is that last year and for periods before this, the likes of FTX and the likes of a few other bad actors in the space that were facilitating uh, trades between people discovered, like they've long learned from watching others in the traditional finance world, this idea of rehypothecating or selling assets to buyers that don't know that they're buying an asset that someone else has already paid for. For example, if I wanted to sell you this coffee mug that I have next to me, and you said, "Sure, I'll take that coffee mug, but I want you to hold it in custody, Ted. I would just want to buy it and own it. I just want to know that I own it." And I say, "Sure, I'll sell it to you for $8 US." And somebody else comes along that you don't know about and says, "I'd like to buy that coffee cup." And I say, "Sure, I've got plenty in stock. How many do you want?" They're like, "Well, I'll take two." And I'm like, "That's $16 US." They say, "Okay, great. I'll pay you. I just want you to hang on to it though until I ask for it." And this has been going on since time began, probably. But I think the collapse of STX, uh, it made it into the lexicon a little bit, or there's this idea of rehypothecating. And what FTX was doing is they were selling people Bitcoin in their accounts and telling them that they had purchased this Bitcoin, but they were taking the same basic amount of Bitcoin they had and then using it as the basis to be able to sell it to many, many, many people. And then only at the time that they wanted to transfer it off the exchange would they then actually supply them with that Bitcoin. And I think what happened with when this got out into the world and people started to move their assets off exchanges, and I'm talking about everyday caterpillars like you and I, it caused the exchanges of the world to realize that they had to get out of this business. Perhaps this is just theory, and it's conspiracy theory, no less. And that people started actually buying up in mass Bitcoin that they needed just in case their customers wanted to redeem it, in a manner of speaking, and pull it off the exchange. They had to actually have it. or else they're going to get caught with their pants down. So that's my
No, that's
theory.
great. That's a great explanation of that, and rehypothecation can happen with stocks, it can happen with bonds, it can happen with gold. And the key difference here with Bitcoin and why it's so important to take your Bitcoin off the exchange is exactly that reason. When you take your Bitcoin off the exchange, you eliminate that risk of rehypothecation. If it's in your cold wallet, they can't. You own it. You are the bearer owner of that asset, right? And you cannot change that. You cannot mess with it. You can't quote unquote print more bitcoins. Another way to say it, people say FTX was making paper Bitcoin, right?
Hmm.
And I think we have to be ready for different variations of this, right? Because that's how they've been able to suppress the gold and silver markets for many years.
That's right, and that's a good example. And I guess the last way to articulate this simply is imagine if you went to Google, you did a search for a product that you wanted to buy, and you landed on somebody's Shopify store. And let's say that they had an inventory number there that said 10 that were in stock, and you thought, okay, great. If they have 10 in stock, I just want one. Okay, I'll pay for it. And then you swipe your card digitally, so to speak, and you get your email confirmation that says, "Thanks for your payment. Your order is going to ship in 3 business days." And then 2 business days go by, and you get an email from the store that you purchased this item from, and they say, "Oh, sorry, we made a mistake. We don't actually have that item in inventory. Could we refund your money, or could we give you something else? Is there another product that you're interested in?" This happens every day of the year without fail. And what I'm trying to say is it illustrates that somebody was able to facilitate a sale and close a transaction on an item that wasn't in stock. So that's the rehypothecation thing that I think is the most, or like as you begin your journey to understand rehypothecation, perhaps, is to think of it in very simple terms, and then think about, as you start to develop that basic understanding, your mind may wander and think in more complex terms about how there's gold and silver stored in vaults, and then people make it available for sale, and they use quote unquote paper contracts to facilitate the inventory. But inevitably, because there's human beings involved, it's never 100% accurate, and the temptation to then be able to offer things for sale to facilitate transactions, because there's enough lag time between when people realize what they were purchasing isn't actually in stock, and the time that the people were selling can go and get it. Uh, uh, this happens all the time, and I can make 10 examples, but I won't. And we can get back on track and just talk about how we've had a good run up in price, and I think there's many variables that have contributed to this, and it's been overall a good thing that people have woken up, in a manner of speaking, and decided to take some counterparty risk off the table and buy some Bitcoin, move it to a cold storage, get it off the exchange, and actually take possession, which is something you just still can't do necessarily with US dollars in the same way that you can with Bitcoin. And I
Yeah,
just,
and that's
I'll
the
say it
be
like
that's
that.
the yeah, that's so the power of Bitcoin, and then also with other cryptocurrencies too. It's important to take all of your cryptocurrencies off the exchanges. But let's move on to kind of the economic calendar, Ted. And we can talk about
Sure.
some of the headwinds we might face this week as we get into, they take the month of April, right, off the Fed. So we're not going to get any rate hikes this month. But I think the consensus now is that we're going to get another 25 basis point rate hike in May. And so let's kind of talk about what we've got coming up, this week, and what people might want to pay attention to as it reflects to, or applies to the price of Bitcoin.
So I think the main takeaway from looking at this, or looking at the economic calendar, the announce the this list of announcements, in a manner of speaking, there's the things that we need to keep an eye on, is that there's going to be the Fed, what we lovingly refer to as the Fed, some Fed talking heads. And what I mean by that is that certain Fed governors around the U.S. Now, take some conspiracy layer off of this. I don't think that, nothing happens by accident necessarily. And what I mean by that is that these announcements and these speaking engagements have been scheduled for some time. So the timing is is perhaps somewhat suspect, but not entirely. And what is more important to understand is that anytime someone like the Fed Williams or Harker or any of the others, Powell is included in this one. He's the one that, as chairman of the Federal Reserve here in the U.S., is the one that people pay the most attention to. But those who are a little bit more steeped in financial markets than others tend to listen to when any one of the Fed governors talks, because unfortunately, people in the financial media tend to pick up on this. And interesting times we live in, where the last year we saw interest rates go from next to nothing to nearly 5%, and we've seen the fallout from that, like the bank failures and other strain on the system, and causing things like the debt ceiling argument to be brought back into the media again. And I won't even do it. I'm not even going to talk about it. Sorry, forgive me. But the point that I'm trying to illustrate for this week is that we have 1, 2, 3, I think 4 Fed governors are giving speeches that are probably going to talk about where we are in the current rate hiking cycle, and they're gonna follow their script, and they're probably going to talk about how we haven't tackled inflation, and more rate hikes are necessary. And this unfortunately puts a little bit of a wet blanket on risk markets like equities and other things that are considered risk assets, meaning stocks, crypto, and there's a lot of things that there's a lot of ammunition in the chest, so to speak, from the Fed's perspective about, or that they will probably use, and words are one of them. And the thing I'm really trying to drive home here is that in addition to the Fed speak, I think it's Wednesday, we have the inflation numbers. CPI is announced on the 12th. So 2 days from now, there's the CPI number, which is the inflation number, which is what a lot of people have been paying attention to over the last, I don't know, 6 months, maybe more. And there's this narrative that inflation was getting way out of control, and the Fed is having to act, but the Fed's acting too quickly, and they're going to cause a recession. I mean, there's 10 different ways to look at this. The point I'm trying to get to is that interesting confluence of events this week. We have Fed governors talking about the CPI number, and I believe those are the most salient points to bring up. And if I looking on my own side here, just to make sure, mortgage applications on Wednesday. This isn't necessarily something that a lot of people that are in financial markets look at all the time, but it's interesting because of interest rates having moved so high so quickly in the last year, is that it's put a bit of a crimp on home sales, perhaps. I mean, maybe my armchair analyst perception and statement there isn't entirely accurate, because there's a lot of people that still are buying homes. They're just paying a lot more for their mortgages, which isn't, it's 6 of one, half dozen the other. It doesn't necessarily stop people, but it sure does make a good headline. The other thing that comes out on Wednesday, the other thing that comes out on Wednesday is the FOMC minutes. People will be paying attention to that largely around the world. Especially if you're in another country and you're doing business and you have a lot of US dollar denominated debt that you have to make payments on. And with the stronger US dollar compared to your local currency, you're having to work harder to earn more of your local currency to get the same amount of dollars to make your loan payments. So put that in your pipe and smoke it a little bit and see, and you'll start to understand. And then last but not least, on Friday, in addition to another Fed governor, the retail sales numbers and Michigan consumer sentiment are things that people in the financial world, in the financial media especially, pay attention to. So I would just advise to consider looking at the calendar and see what sort of things might make headlines this week that might trigger more volatility. I think what people are actually looking for here, this is just my theory, and the last thought here is that people are looking for more volatility to come back into the market, because that's what facilitates trades and transactions, and that's where money's made, is when trades happen. So
Got it. Yeah.
volume needs to come back and volatility needs to come back, or else people in the financial world are going to get mad.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, just from kind of from somebody who has this on the radar but doesn't really pay attention to it. Like the important thing is here, financial market participants pay attention to when these people speak and make decisions sometimes around what they say or use in a larger aggregate of information to make decisions. So a lot of times you may see markets move on some, a Fed speech or CPI numbers or mortgage. There's all kinds of things to put into this. But yeah, it's just important to have on your radar. And then as far as I'm concerned, I think Ted, you did a great job kind of outlining everything that we've got to look at this week and pay attention to. So we'll keep that in on our radar, and then I think we can move on to kind of something that's interesting. I saw this tweet this morning that Russia becomes the second most powerful Bitcoin miner in the world. Basically Fred Thiel he's saying it's time for the U.S. to double down to ensure that Bitcoin mining thrives and grows in the U.S., or the exact countries the U.S. has sanctioned will control a large portion of the global hash rate of Bitcoin. And so I think this goes to the game theory of Bitcoin and how eventually it leads to nation state adoption. And my God, how fast we've gotten here. Like 3 years ago, this headline, you wouldn't have even considered it, right? Like it was something that we talked about. And I think that the thing to think here is that they are getting involved, right? Like you have nation states paying attention to this. I mean, we know this in the United States. In the past quarter, it became very, very apparent that the current administration is not doing anything to particularly help the Bitcoin and crypto industry. But with that said, the game theory of Bitcoin suggests that if the U.S. wants to make a strategic mistake and not support Bitcoin mining, other countries will, because it's in their economic incentive and benefit to do it. Right? Like that's kind of like the main point here is that, without getting overly complex with this, look, somebody in the world is going to mine Bitcoin.
Yes, and what's interesting is that as the rhetoric has ramped up over time against Russia, for example, and we've long since I'll take a tangent real quick. We've long since forgotten about talking about the Chinese and their human rights violations and other big nations around the world. And I mean, when I say big, I mean economically somewhat important because of the amount of trade activity that they facilitate, especially in our globalized world, which some might say is starting to unravel a bit if you're reading Peter Zeihan, but I digress. So what I'm trying to communicate here is that for a long time the Chinese were the big bad wolf, and but here we are now, where because of what's happened with Russia and Ukraine and the morass that the Germans, for example, other entities in Europe find themselves in, where they're having to purchase, because of the political climate, for example, against nuclear power. It's been political suicide to suggest that nations in Europe lean on nuclear power to sustain their energy security, or ramp up their energy security, and become reliant on other nations like Russia for things like natural gas. They've really been feeling the pinch. And the point I'm trying to get to here is that I think it's really interesting that as the current administration has ramped up this anti-crypto rhetoric in the media, and you see the big mouths of Elizabeth Warren, whose only specialty in life is just to make a lot of noise and to instill fear in people, and somehow keeps getting elected. I don't understand this, but I think I do understand, is that if you look at her donor list, then you know how. But the point I'm trying to get to is that the crypto ecosystem, there's a statistically significant number of components that are a threat to the traditional finance system, especially globally, because over the last what 70 years. We've become this globalized this globalized economy, and there's goods and services are swapped from nation state to nation state across vast oceans, for example, and across vast terrains, and payments are facilitated in multiple currencies, and it's created an opportunity for the money changers to step in and be the middlemen, and that's Wall Street at large, and that's the Wall Streets of the world. There are the New Yorks of the world, the Londons, the Shanghais, Singapore, Hong Kongs of the world have stepped in to be able to facilitate globalized trade and collect on both ends of the transaction. The person making the transaction pays, the person receiving the transaction pays, the person in the middle makes money on both sides of the trade, in a manner of speaking. And that is the thing that I believe is at the root, that's the root cause of the current traditional finance system putting the money that they've, the rent seeking activity that, and I'm not against rent seeking necessarily. I just think it's interesting that when I just think it's interesting that it's somewhat obvious that the traditional finance system is fighting to keep the ground that it's taken over the last 30, 40 years in being able to facilitate and be a part of as many transactions as they can. So they make money when markets go up, they make money when markets go down. When someone's buying something, they make something. When someone's selling something, they make something. And crypto rails are something that they don't have the ability to compete with necessarily in the same way, and be able to build moats around these like the Swift network that facilitates international banking transactions. And now that Russia has it's painted itself into a corner somewhat. Maybe that's not the right way to say it, but they've attacked another country, and politically, we've had to, in the U.S. and around the world, we've had to say, Russia bad, no do business with Russia, and we're going to sanction you. We're going to do all this other stuff. But Russia's not stupid. They've already given this some thought, and I think the fact that it's now surfacing in the mainstream media that they have invested so much energy, time, and effort into building Bitcoin mining infrastructures because they understand the power of crypto rails to move money around the world at the speed of light. And they don't have to rely on the existing financial system. And they don't have to worry about uh, on this so far.
Yeah, you you kind of went into the matrix there for about 5 seconds at the end, but I think that's well said. And the general idea is that the United States, should be making every effort they can to embrace Bitcoin mining and bring as much Bitcoin mining to our shores as possible. And the idea here is that Russia's going to do it, China's going to do it, Kazakhstan's going to do it, Japan's going to do it, Europe's going to do it, South America's going to do it, Canada's going to do it. Every nation state, in the end, will eventually be competing for hash power in the Bitcoin network. And now is a time to make, actually, 3 years ago was the time, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, was a time to start making this strategic investment. And somebody who talks about this ad nauseum is Jason Lowery, and he's written a book called Soft War, and it's a novel theory on power projection and the national strategic significance of Bitcoin. And so he's made the argument that the United States should be doing exactly that. And I've not read his book yet. This is, something that is for a new person starting is, probably not the first thing they need to understand with Bitcoin, but it's definitely up there. And that this plays into the reason of why it's so important in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And when you talk about the game theory of Bitcoin, that's the interesting part to me, right? Not necessarily the specific parts of how it all goes down, but this idea that it is in ultimately a nation state's best interest to participate in the Bitcoin network and not ban the Bitcoin network. And so you may have countries and nation states like China that quote unquote bans Bitcoin mining, right? Now, I saw something recently that they still account for like 20% of Bitcoin mining hash power in the world, which is interesting, right? Because it's banned. I wonder who's mining over there in China. But sorry, I had a cough. That's the game theory idea behind Bitcoin, that these nation states will cooperate on some stuff and not on other things, but it is in there. They are incentivized to participate in the Bitcoin network, as opposed to ban it, because if they ban it, other nation states will participate in the Bitcoin network. And if you get into a situation where Bitcoin is used for international trade, because you've got a situation right now where the world is de-dollarizing, and it's a lot easier to send Bitcoin than it is gold to nation states to exchange items. And so that's the general idea behind game theory. Now it's much more complex than that. I am hitting it from a 50,000-foot overview. But do you have any comments on kind of the game theory idea and the idea that the United States should be participating in hash power? And when I say hash power, what do I mean? I mean that the hash power is these graphics card and these computers called ASICs running to try to guess the next Bitcoin blockchain, right? Like they're trying to solve a math problem to get the next Bitcoin block reward. So as you add more of these miners, the hash power goes up, right? And so nation states should be having, they call it hash wars, right? Because that's what's going to eventually happen. You'll have nation states competing for hash power on the Bitcoin network.
Yeah, I guess the simplest way to, or a simple way to look at this is, in my opinion, from my perspective, that is, the, think of the hash power as like how secure the network, the Bitcoin network is. There's always going to be bad actors and people that are trying to obfuscate and work around the rules and try to, just for no other reason in some cases than to just that somebody else is doing something and somebody doesn't like that somebody else is doing something. I mean, there's an infinite number of reasons why somebody would want to, interrupt what's happening, is probably a simple way to say it. But this idea of hash power is that as people or as machines, which are purchased by people and put into action to participate in the Bitcoin network, there's a certain level of computational energy or computational effort that's needed to run the machine, or a lot, or capital is put to work by people who put the machines into the rack, so to speak, and plug them into the internet and participate in the network. So this idea of mining machines and validators and other types of nodes that participate in the network all get together and constitute the entirety of the network. The mining contingent is the part that participates in or facilitates the consensus mechanism called proof of work. And this is what validates transactions as being valid and allowed on the network. And it's a security mechanism in that when a transaction is put to the network to say, I want to facilitate this transaction, it can come from anywhere. The mining constituent, or yes, the mining contingent, I should say, any participant in the mining pools will get that, and any one of those miners will get that transaction and will validate it. And if it's not valid, if it's a bad transaction, it's malformed, it's incorrect in some way, it will be rejected. But let's say it is a valid transaction, it will make it into the pool. It's called the mempool for the next block, and then ultimately the mining, the proof of work mining effort is what writes the transactions into the blockchain, which can then be validated across. And this is the cycle of life in a manner of speaking for a Bitcoin transaction. Why is this important? So you think about the ability to ensure that you have think about the ability to ensure that you have access to the Bitcoin blockchain. Having some hash power located on your shores is a big part of that, because you can ultimately you're competing for the block subsidy, and that's another important thing to understand is the 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 network itself rewards good behavior to participants in the mining contingent when some valid entity that's mining completes the proof of work math problem every 10 minutes or so and says, I declare I've solved the problem. The network validates that and then awards the block subsidy to that entity. And that block gets written into the blockchain forever. And then the whole process begins again, and we start trying to solve the next problem that comes down the pipe for the opportunity to write the block into the blockchain and get the subsidy. So you think about the subsidy as the incentive for participation, and it should start to become obvious why it's a good idea economically, perhaps, but also just ensuring that the hash power, you have access to it. Because what happens if Russia, if all of the mining left and went to one country, it should be obvious what the risks are there. Because what if Russia decides to turn off all the internet access to other countries but their own, and all of the Bitcoin mining hash power is there, then cuts off the rest of the world. It's very nearly impossible for something like that to happen. But what the point I'm trying to illustrate is that and I think the people a lot smarter than me, like the Jason Lowrys of the world and the Saifedean Ammous's of the world. I don't think I pronounced his name right there, but the point I'm trying to get to is and the book is the Bitcoin Standard. Perhaps something like the Bitcoin Standard is a better place for a beginner to start, because they'll talk a little bit about the economic principles that underlie this thing that we call the Bitcoin network, and the way Bitcoin is transacted, the way miners work, the way nodes work, the way participants work, how Bitcoin comes into existence, and how the governance, which is also known as Bitcoin's ingrained into its DNA, the monetary policy that dictates how Bitcoin is going to operate and what the rules are. And all I'm trying to say here is that once you start to learn how these things operate and how important it is that the hash power is strong and that there's good actors, it will start to make sense why it's such a big deal, and why nation states at the nation state level, there will be competition for hash power. It's more of a security imperative, and making sure that they have access to the network and all of the benefits of the network to facilitate economic strength, perhaps, and the ability to transact in the safest and most stable way in light of things like central bank fiat denominated current or fiat monies that tend to get debased over time and become less and less useful and more risky to use in international trade, for example. So
Yeah, and
I
as
don't know if that was
Bitcoin
coherent or useful, but there it
no,
is.
I think you did a great job. It's somewhat of a complex topic, but as Bitcoin adoption continues to grow, this becomes more and more important from a nation state perspective, because you do want to control hash power. If you have a lot of citizens, which in the United States it's around 40 or 50 million people that own Bitcoin and crypto, and again, you have to realize, separate Bitcoin from crypto. They are two different things. Both have a place in your portfolio from an investment perspective, in my opinion, right? But as Bitcoin adoption continues to increase and you have more citizens of your nation that own and use the Bitcoin network, you want to have control of a certain amount of the hash rate. And then it goes back to, why can't they stop Bitcoin? Well, if the United States hated Bitcoin and wanted to stop it, there's certainly things they could do, right? But they could just say they shut down every Bitcoin miner in the United States. It wouldn't kill Bitcoin, because you have Bitcoin miners in Russia, you have Bitcoin miners in China, you have Bitcoin miners in Europe and South America. And so when we talk about game theory, it's in the United States' best interest to protect the Bitcoin miners that are here and incentivize more Bitcoin miners to come here. And because they can't get rid of it, right? Like, if they could just turn off the switch to all the Bitcoin miners in the United States and it be gone, I think they would probably try to do that, right? But because they can't, and you have to get, in order for something like that to happen, you have to get all these nation states to cooperate and agree. And that's not going to happen, because one of them is going to say, you know what, I have an economic incentive here to continue to mine Bitcoin, right? And that's the game theory aspect of it, and that's why it makes Bitcoin very hard to kill from a government level. One of the reasons, right? And so, I think when you think about all this stuff and you look at what the United States position has currently been, and there are this administration is taking a a hard stance, right, against truthfully against Bitcoin and crypto. But you have to remember that at the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter because this thing is out of the bag. The cat's out of the bag. We are hash rate is at an all-time high or close to it. Adoption is growing like crazy. It's better to participate in the network than try to cut the on and off rails off and do all these weird things they're doing. And there's a great podcast this weekend, I sent it to you, Ted, with Tom Luongo and Caitlin Long, where she talks about essentially what may be happening here is at the back end of these banks is so antiquated and outdated that they're in a flat out panic because Bitcoin and crypto has already surpassed, their technology. And for these banks to catch up, it's millions of dollars in investment and a lot of time. And, so there's a lot of different angles to all of this, right? That you just have to keep in mind when you hear everything on TV constantly is FUD, 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 FUD. There's so much more involved in this than just, magic internet money number go up.
Yes, you might say that the Bitcoin network in its entirety is becoming an organism that is greater than just the sum of the parts. Like a human being is a bunch of constituent parts, or component parts, I should say, and you get it together and it starts to do something that doesn't necessarily, or you wouldn't necessarily think would be possible. But the interesting thing about banking, legacy banking infrastructure is there's I'm just going to say it's oftentimes it's less expensive to buy influence in the lobbying sense than it is to upgrade your existing infrastructure. You're really buying time.
Yep.
And it's cheaper, meaning it's there's all sorts of incentives there. We're making political campaign contributions, and we're doing this, and we're doing this, and we're doing this. And we're spending money here. We're spending this is the cost of doing business. It goes on the line item from the accountants for a line item to be tax deductible in some cases to do nasty things like this. It's just real life, and nothing we can do about it necessarily to change that. But the point I'm trying.
Yeah, well, I was
Sorry,
just
go
going to
ahead.
say, easier to donate than innovate.
Bingo. I couldn't have said it better myself. It's better to, or it is oftentimes economically more sensible, believe it or not, to out vector a certain amount of capital that you could use to innovate, to just donate or put to work in a lobbying context. Again, the big corporations have like substantial, I mean, they have resources on the level that it's hard for us as individuals trying to operate our lives can really understand. And you get the incentive structures in these complex dealings get to be like I don't know how to, I mean, it's really tough to describe.
Well, everybody's making a lot of money with the current as things exist today, right? In this current system, and that's not what's necessarily best for customers. And so this new technology comes along that is a better solution, and now they can donate all they want. It doesn't matter because customers are leaving legacy banking and going to this new system, not because they hate banks, but it's because the new thing is better. Bitcoin is an innovation that serves customers' needs better than traditional financial systems. And you can't, what these financial systems maybe should have been doing is not donating as much to lobbying groups and maybe investing more in the back ends of their, companies, right? I don't know for a fact that they did or didn't do that, right? It's just, it certainly seems when you listen to experts like Caitlin Long, who is, and by the way, anybody new to Bitcoin, or even if you aren't new. Got to give her a follow. She's fantastic. If you want to learn about the Fed and banking, and she can say this stuff and articulate it in a way that we can understand is like you call us, Ted, caterpillars. We're just normal people that aren't involved in this stuff every day. Caitlin's a great follow, but that I listened to that over the weekend, and it just clicked for me that, wait a second, maybe this is more of an old problem than some sort of like government saying that the tech is terrible. What this really is, or could potentially be, is lobbying groups protecting big banks who have antiquated back end systems, and they're buying time to figure out what to do.
I mean, I'll put a bow on this. There are still, if you go on LinkedIn or any other job site, you can still find open positions in 2023 in April for AS400 programmers, COBOL programmers. These are systems that are like 30, 40 years old that facilitated the digitization of banking in the early days when we went from I got my paycheck in my hand and I take it to the bank and I'm going to cash it or I'm going to deposit it. And if I wanted to know how much money I had in the bank, I would have to go to the branch, fill out the little slip, show my ID, and say, "Can you tell me how many dollars I have in my account?" Or if I wanted to make a withdrawal, I would have to go to the bank branch during banking hours. Old school by today's standards. And they had to drag the legacy banking system into kicking and screaming into the information age and the age of the internet. And it's only now in the last few years that you've been able to do things like send a wire from your laptop, or you can transfer money between. But this will blow your mind. Banks like Bank of America and whatnot, this idea of bank to bank payments, it took something like a Zelle to come along and say, we're going to innovate and develop some tech that allows one person who has one bank out in the world can stand next to somebody and say, well, I have Bank of America. And you say, well, I have JP Morgan Chase. And you say, okay, well, I'm going to send you $100. How do I do that? And they both tap the Zelle button, or one taps the Zelle button, the other says, okay, I'll tap it, and say, boom. It took a third party, and it took an intermediary in the last several years to facilitate the ability for money to leave one bank quickly and easily to go to another. And that took, I mean, as someone who's worked with software for more than 25 years now, and it's the people involved that are the problem. Okay, so the point I'm trying to get to is that it took a third party, and now we have these new rails that money can move at the same pace of information across the wire, and even wirelessly across oceans, across borders, across regimes, across just about everything you can think about across people's political beliefs. The money doesn't care anymore, or it actually never did. I should say that's not even accurate. The money, whatever the money is or was, never actually cared. The point I'm trying to get to is that the pace of innovation is in these legacy institutions that they've gotten so big. There's so many well-developed channels for money to flow, is that it becomes against your best interest if you're a well-entrenched participant to change. Like, meaning the pace of change slows as the organization grows in size and becomes, and they figure out their business model. And the last thing they really want to do is change the business model because it works to them. And I'm trying to be fair and neutral here as well. I'm not trying to sound like
Well, you don't
I'm
you don't
special.
necessarily no, you don't necessarily have to be fair and neutral, because they aren't fair and neutral, right? The system has worked very well
That's
for
right.
them, but not necessarily well for everybody else. And so now, Bitcoin has presented us with an option, and a lot of us have decided that this is a better option for us. It's not anything else. And so what might be in the best interest of big banks is certainly not in the best interest of Josh or Ted or anybody that, may be a normal person working a 9 to 5 or building your own business. And so all any individual can do is take the best opportunity that is presented in front of them, and Bitcoin is a better technology. It just is, and a lot of the crypto companies are developing solutions around payment rails and things of that nature that are just better tech, and they're better for the average individual, and that's what will win out. Now, what it seems to be happening right now is the current administration is very affected by donors and lobbyists and the old system, and they're it's like an old house. And I make this analogy, nothing against old people, but a lot of these people are really old. They don't want to change, right? You got a cash cow, and the banks are printing money that they're using, and a lot of these senators get big donations from these banks to keep things the same way they've always been. And why would they ever want to change that? But unfortunately for them, change is coming whether they want to or not, because of stuff we talked about earlier in the show. And because for a lot of people, it just doesn't work. I mean, just take the idea that if I want to move money on a Saturday afternoon, and there's a million reasons why I might want to do that. I own my own business, right? I make decisions on Saturday afternoon. If I want to, purchase real estate or make an investment, why do I need to wait, 48 hours to move money? That's just a simple one, right? Like, that's just, to me, and after being in crypto for 6 years, it's like I would never do that. I'll never go back to that system where I can't make an investment or buy something whenever I want to, right? Like, it's just silly now to even think about that.
I can tell you why. Because if you want to buy something on the weekend and you don't want to use a credit card and participate in the payment network that benefits the big banks on both sides of the transaction, and you can send 100,000 US dollars to an exchange, for example, and not have to wire the money. For example, let's say you're using a stable coin and you want to move money from one entity to the other in 5 minutes and pay next to nothing in fees, for example, then the bank loses out on a $26 wire fee that you didn't have to call in on Monday morning at 9:05 a.m. and say, "Hi, I'd like to have access to my own money, please." And they say, "Oh, for the pleasure, we're going to charge you $26 to move. We're gonna punch a few keys on our keyboard and move some money for you, and now that'll be $26 for us." Meaning,
What's
you know
funny
what I mean?
about what's funny about bank fees, and it doesn't matter if they're $4 or $20. Everybody hates bank fees, and I think it's just out of principle, right? Like, if you pull out $500 out of an ATM, they hit you for $4 or $5, and I don't know why that chaps my ass so hard, but it does. It's just like, it's just one of those things. And it's the same thing with a wire. Like, come on, like, but again, it's better tech. You can move the money. You could use Bitcoin. You could use stablecoin. You could use, I don't know about Ethereum. Sometimes Ethereum gets expensive to use, but you know,
That's
it,
true. That's true. But it
so
is, you can make the convenience argument. Oh, well, Ted, we had to invest and build this ATM or buy this ATM and put it here and pay for the electricity, blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine. But what I think is the most frustrating. I think the fees thing is just that it's such low. And I guess I'm trying to be neutral, not necessarily fair or unfair. I'm trying to be somewhat neutral and look at this from both angles. Is the cost of building out this infrastructure, or is the bank's going to try and make it look like they have bent over backwards for you, but the truth is that they get to benefit from legislation. They get to, there's tax incentives for them to build out their banking branches the way they do, and it's not like they're suffering. You know what I mean? And I'm not, look, being in business myself, and I think you understand this, is that it takes a lot of energy, effort, and there's a lot of risk. So I'm not necessarily mad at them for wanting to be in business. But what's interesting is that they want to charge for access to your own money. Uh, but what they do but you don't get any say. Here's the best part: is you don't get any say in what they do when you deposit your U.S. dollars in the bank. They take them. They can, and they do. They take them and do whatever they want. They make risky investments. They make non-risky investments. They make money on your money. And then when you look at the interest rate that you might earn for parking your cash, say at Bank of America, and you think, man, I'm putting my money in this bank. I'm earning a little bit, and you look at some of these interest rate pay, like the 0.01%. If you have 50,000 or 100,000 or $1 million sitting in Bank of America, for example, they'll pay you some ridiculously low interest rate on that deposit, but then they turn around and they're making 5% from the Fed,
Yep.
paid directly to them. You know what I mean? It's just it. People are waking up, maybe a bit slow, but people are starting to understand these things. It's like, well, wait a minute. Not only are you taking the money, you're earning a statistically significant interest rate on it. You're paying me a statistically significantly lower number on that for me taking the risk of putting it in your institution, which could fail at any second because of all of the bad decisions that your people might make. And then on top of that, if I want to use some of the money that I gave you that you're making money on, then you're going to charge me to take it back out. And every time I want to, people are like, well, wait a minute, hold the phone. Something's not right. It doesn't, the numbers aren't adding up.
Well,
It's
you're
not
not.
mutually beneficial.
Yeah, and you're not rewarded appropriately for the risk you're taking by putting money in the bank, and it's no longer a non-risk, right? And it probably has never been a non-risk, right? So if you were going to say bank X, I'm going to put 100 grand in an account and get 4 or 5%, like you are, okay, great. I'm being rewarded for. I make a decision that it's worth the risk to get that 4% to leave it in the bank. Now, something I'm excited for, and something that you can already do today, and this is where people are waking up. Instead of putting my money in a bank, why wouldn't I just go buy a treasury bill directly from the treasury for 3 or 4% and do exactly what the bank's doing and earn the 4% myself? Like, there's, do I want to take the counterparty risk with the US government? Most people will say absolutely, that's fine. We'll see, right? Like, I don't know, right? I think there's a lot of weird stuff happening right now, but nonetheless, that's has yet nothing to even do with crypto. That's just somebody saying, why would I let the bank earn 4% on this money that I'm not going to use when I could earn the 4% myself? And I think something exciting that crypto is going to do, and I've seen different articles on this, is crypto's tied to T-bills. So you could do this directly with crypto too, right? And I just think the point is, it's the innovation is happening so fast. People are starting to understand, that you're not being rewarded appropriately for leaving money in a bank. You're not being rewarded at all. Actually, there's the upside to leaving your money in a bank is you might get it back.
Yeah. So
That's it.
we live in a world today, and I'll wrap it up with this. We live in a world today where you can take your hard-earned money, you can put it in the bank, and the bank could go out of business the next day, and then you have to fight to claim what is yours. You could have taken the cash and put it under your mattress, and it would have been safer.
Yeah. No.
And
And
on top of that,
okay.
the bank takes the money that you give them, and they invest it, and they take risk to try and earn a return, and what they get back in return, they keep most of it, and they give you the slightest little bit. So you're having to take all of the same. You're literally taking the same risk that the bank is taking. You're volunteering and agreeing by depositing your cash in the bank. I hereby agree to participate in all of the investments that you're going to make. By virtue of the fact, and it's implied that you're agreeing to this because you're giving them your money, and you're agreeing to every term and condition that exists in the 4,000 pieces of paper and the 80 billion lines of terms and conditions legalese that is 100% guaranteed to screw you if you ever have to get into a disagreement with the financial institution. And thankfully, there are other choices nowadays.
Well, yeah. That's
And
at the end of the day. Look, you don't have to do anything, right? Like, you don't have to put your money in your bank. There's a lot of convenience to it, right? So, and again,
it's true.
banks offer services today that are extremely valuable. There's lending. They have money management services that they can do for their clients. So it's not necessarily like, this isn't like screaming at bank. And I'm not, typically when I talk about banks, I'm talking about large institutions, right? Like the JP Morgans and all this stuff. I think community banks are essential for, you know, rural America, right? Like, everybody forgets about all the land in between LA and New York. a lot of stuff happening here, right? And so, the community banks, I do think have a role, and I think what you're going to start seeing is state banks start taking a more active role. And so, like something in like Tennessee or Texas, they're talking about using a gold-backed, silver-backed, banking system, right, and issuing their own currency that's backed by that. So there's all stuff that's happening, all interesting. So that is something to watch and pay attention to. But I think this is a good place to wrap it up for today. Touched on a couple different things. We talked about some Fed minutes that are coming up, or some Fed meetings to pay attention to. We kind of touched on the game theory of Bitcoin. That's something you could spend hours on, and go all the way down the rabbit hole. But you start to see Russia being the second largest miner. Talked about why the United States should embrace Bitcoin mining from a game theory perspective, and then kind of got into at the end there some of the issues with why the banking system is being outpaced by Bitcoin innovation, and this may just be the old system trying to buy itself time with some of these senators coming out and attacking Bitcoin and seeing where it is. At the end of the day, the decentralized monetary network is a better solution, in my opinion, and I think Ted's as well. So,
Agreed.
good place to wrap it up, and then we'll hit you with the do your own research. None of this is financial advice, investment advice. Don't do anything because you heard us talking about it. Do your own research.